Good evening, ladies. It is Madam Reed. Tonight's story is about a woman who spent 10 years turning a rough-edged businessman into old money, only to be handed a $5 million goodbye and replaced by a wellness coach who realigns financial auras with crystals. What Victoria Sterling did with the bankrupt company they threw at her like a consolation prize is, frankly, art. Let's begin. The clinking of baccarat crystal flutes at the Autumn Heritage Gala always sounded like tiny silver bells. But tonight, to Victoria Sterling, it sounded like a countdown. She stood beneath the soaring vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom, encased in a midnight blue gown that cost more than most people's mortgages. For exactly 10 years, Victoria had played the role of the flawless billionaire's wife. She remembered every donor's name, smiled at every unpalatable joke from fossil fuel tycoons, and spent a decade sanding down the rough, newly rich edges of her husband, Clifford Vance, until he shone like old money. She took a sip of her champagne, smiling politely at a senator's wife, before subtly glancing across the sea of tuxedos to find her husband. She found him by the ice sculpture, and then the breath froze in her throat. Clifford wasn't just talking to a guest. He was standing entirely too close to a girl who looked like she hadn't yet celebrated her 25th birthday. The girl was wearing an offensively bright emerald silk slip dress that belonged at a Miami Beach club, not a black tie Manhattan fundraiser. But it wasn't the dress that made Victoria's manicured fingers tighten around the stem of her glass. It was Clifford's hand. His large, familiar palm, the hand adorned with the platinum wedding band she had chosen 10 years ago, was resting casually, possessively, firmly on the bare skin of the girl's lower back. As Victoria watched, the girl threw her head back in a loud laugh and leaned her chest directly against Clifford's arm. Clifford looked down at her with a hungry, unguarded expression that Victoria hadn't seen directed at herself since their honeymoon. An ethereal wave of nausea hit Victoria, sharp and sudden, followed instantly by the icy, paralyzing grip of her aristocratic upbringing. Never make a scene, her mother's voice whispered in the back of her mind. Tears are for the help. Clifford caught her eye across the room. Instead of flinching, his jaw set. He leaned in, whispered something into the girl's ear that made her bite her lip, and then began walking straight toward Victoria. He didn't offer his arm. "We need to talk," Clifford said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the warmth he had just been showering on the girl in emerald green. "Private lounge now." He didn't wait for her reply, turning on his heel. Victoria maintained her effortless, photogenic smile as she wove through the crowd, nodding at acquaintances, all while the perfectly constructed architecture of her life began to crack down the middle. The door of the VIP lounge clicked shut behind them, instantly muting the string quartet playing in the ballroom. The room smelled of expensive leather, oak paneling, and the faint, bitter scent of Clifford's scotch. "Let me guess," Victoria said smoothly, her voice a cool alto, setting her champagne on a mahogany side table. "A midlife crisis," clicked Faye in cheap silk. "Should I contact the PR team to draft a statement about a brief lapse in judgment? Or is she expecting a condo in Tribeca?" "Don't do that, Victoria," Clifford snapped, pacing the length of the Persian rug. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Don't do that condescending Ice Queen routine. Not tonight." "My apologies," she murmured, her eyes tracing the gold embroidery on his tuxedo jacket, a jacket she had flown to London to have fitted for him. "Tell me, who is she?" "Her name is Chloe," Clifford said, lifting his chin defiantly. "She's a spiritual wellness coach, and she actually listens to me. She makes me feel alive, something I haven't felt in this mausoleum of a marriage for years." Victoria stared at him, a wellness coach. The man who ruthlessly gutted rival real estate firms before his morning coffee was having an existential awakening with a 20-something who probably cleansed her aura with sage. It was so brutally cliché, it almost felt like a comedy. Before Victoria could speak, Clifford reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick, folded sheaf of legal paper. He practically threw it onto the glass coffee table between them. "It is over, Victoria. This is a separation agreement. My lawyers drew up an addendum to the prenup yesterday. I am offering you $5 million tax-free. You walk away quietly, no fuss, no dragging my name through the mud, and we call it a day." Victoria slowly looked down at the documents, then back up at the man she had built from the ground up. $5 million. It was a spectacular insult. She had brought him into her family S-tier of society, shielded his chaotic bookkeeping, and smoothed over his disastrous public relations blunders for a decade. The very company he was so proud of was standing on the pillars of her family's connections. $5 million, Victoria repeated, her voice dripping with lethal silk. She picked up a half-full glass of a resting on a nearby cart. She swirled the dark crimson liquid, admiring the way the light caught its bloody hue. "Clifford, you have always been a man who craved the thoroughbreds, but truly belonged in a petting zoo. If you think $5 million buys my quiet departure from an empire I built with my own hands, your spiritual wellness coach has completely destroyed your last remaining brain cell." Clifford scoffed, his face flushing red. "You didn't build anything, Victoria. You just smiled and ordered catering. You are a cold, unfeeling robot. Chloe is a real woman. Now, sign the damn paper, or I swear, 10 years of memorizing donor names, smoothing PR disasters, and making a brute presentable to polite society." And his parting verdict: "You are a cold, unfeeling robot." The wine wasn't rage, it was a baptism. The old Victoria died on that Persian rug. The new one was born in Bordeaux. Some women throw tantrums. Victoria threw a vintage, moving with the sudden, fluid grace of a striking viper. Victoria stepped forward. She didn't yell, she didn't cry. With a careless flick of her wrist, she tilted the crystal glass and poured the vintage red wine directly over Clifford's chest. Clifford gasped, jumping back in sheer shock as the dark red liquid cascaded down his pristine white French cuffed shirt and splashed over the lapels of his exclusive $10,000 Tom Ford jacket, staining it like a gruesome wound. "Are you insane?" he roared, looking down at the ruined silk, his hands hovering over the stain in pure panic. "No," Victoria said softly, placing the empty glass delicately back on the tray. "I am just newly alive." She turned her back on him while he was still sputtering curses, opened the heavy oak door, and stepped back out into the glittering hallway. She walked past the paparazzi at the venue's entrance with her head held high, ignoring the barrage of flashing bulbs. When she slid into the plush leather backseat of her waiting Maybach, the adrenaline finally began to ebb, leaving behind a hollow, freezing ache. She reached for the privacy partition button, craving exactly 1 minute of silence to mourn the death of her youth, before picking up a weapon. Before the glass fully raised, her phone vibrated violently against the leather seat. It was a text message from her mother. Eleanor Victoria unlocked the screen. There was no sympathy, no "Are you okay?" Just 2 lines of text that felt like a final nail driven into her coffin. "Preston just told me about the scene you caused. The board is furious. You are jeopardizing the Vance merger. Come back to the estate immediately tomorrow morning. Do absolutely nothing until your father and I tell you what to do." Victoria stared at the glowing screen as the Maybach pulled into the rainy Manhattan night. She had sacrificed her soul for this family. and at the first sign of trouble, they were already feeding her to the wolves. A slow, treacherous smile spread across her lips. They wanted to see a scene. They had absolutely no idea what she was capable of. The black and white checkered marble of the Sterling family's Greenwich estate had always resembled a chessboard. This morning, as Victoria's stiletto heels echoed sharply across the cavernous foyer, she finally understood her position on it. She was never the queen. She was just a pawn wrapped in silk, waiting to be sacrificed. She walked into the sun-drenched conservatory. The scent of lemon verbena polish and imported orchids was thick enough to choke on. Seated at the head of the antique mahogany table was her mother, Eleanor, impeccably dressed in a pearl-buttoned Chanel suit, stirring her Earl Grey tea as if the world wasn't tea-burning. Beside her sat Victoria's father, a silent, imposing patriarch hiding behind the morning edition of the Wall Street Journal, and leaning casually against the French doors, radiating cheap arrogance, was Preston, her father's illegitimate son, 3 years her junior, a man whose only discernible talent was failing upwards on the family dime. "You are late," Eleanor said, not looking up from her teacup. "Traffic on the FDR was predictably hellish," Victoria replied smoothly, taking a seat across from her mother. She had not slept a single minute. Her eyes, however, betrayed nothing, shielded by a flawless layer of glamour and polite social conditioning. "But I imagine you didn't summon me here to discuss my commute. How is Clifford's suit?" Eleanor finally looked up, her gaze as cold and unforgiving as winter rain. "Clifford's attorneys called your father at 6 o'clock this morning. He is threatening to freeze the entire Hudson Yards redevelopment fund. $3 billion in joint capital, Victoria. All because you couldn't control your temper over some transient little harlot in a cheap dress. I poured a glass of wine on a man who handed me a separation agreement at a charity gala," Victoria corrected softly. "I believe my temper was remarkably well managed. A lesser woman would have used a steak knife. A smart woman would have smiled, taken the girl shopping, and secured the trust fund for her future children." Eleanor snapped, the teacup clinking harshly against the saucer. "You are 38 years old. You are not a romantic teenager in a cheap novel. Marriages at our echelon are corporate mergers, and you are actively tanking the stock." Her father finally lowered his newspaper. "Which is why, as of this morning, the board has convened. You are stepping down from your seat at the Sterling Trust, effective immediately." The words hung in the sunlit air, heavy and suffocating. Victoria felt a cold, metallic taste bloom in the back of her mouth. She had spent the last 5 years doubling the trust's conservative yields. She had sacrificed holidays, anniversaries, and her own peace of mind to keep the Sterling name untouchable. "Stepping down," Victoria repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "And I suppose the board has already selected a replacement." Preston pushed himself off the French doors. He strolled to the table, practically vibrating with smug satisfaction. "Don't worry about the heavy lifting, sis. I'll keep your seat warm. Dad thinks it is time I stepped up to the big leagues anyway. You know, give the board a more masculine presence during this sensitive transition." Victoria stared at him. Preston, who had once lost $2 million in a single weekend in Macau. Preston, who thought diversifying a portfolio meant buying cars in different colors. The insult wasn't just a slap in the face, it was a public execution of her dignity. "I see," Victoria said, her eyes sweeping over the three of them. They weren't her family. They were a board of directors liquidating a liability. "And what is my severance package for a lifetime of unquestioning servitude?" Eleanor slid a polished leather folder across the mahogany table. "We are giving you Maison de Rafave, The holding company owns a few vintage Parisian lingerie and couture brands. They are entirely separate from Clifford S. Reach. You will be quietly repositioned as its CEO. It keeps you busy, it keeps you out of the press, and it keeps you out of Clifford S. Way while we salvage the real estate deal. Victoria opened the folder. Mistress.Free. It was a notoriously dilapidated asset her grandfather had bought in the 80s. The company hadn't turned a profit in 6 years. It was bankrupt, bleeding cash, and practically slated for demolition. They weren't giving her a company, they were giving her a graveyard. Sign the documents, Victoria. Her father rumbled from behind his newspaper. Take your millions in alimony from Clifford, play with the little fashion boutique, and let the men handle the crisis. For 10 seconds, the only sound in the conservatory was the ticking of the mahogany grandfather clock. Victoria looked at the Mont Blanc fountain pen resting on the contract. She could scream. She could tear the paper to shreds and threaten lawsuits. But she knew the golden rule of the elite. The one who shouts first loses slowly. Victoria picked up the heavy gold pen. She didn't hesitate. She dragged the nib across the signature line with sweeping, lethal elegance. Congratulations, Preston, Victoria smiled, standing up and smoothing the skirt of her Dior pencil dress. Try not to bankrupt the trust before Christmas. It would ruin Mother's holiday cards. She turned and walked out of the estate without waiting for a response, her posture perfectly straight, never looking back. 2 hours later, Victoria stood in the center of the Maison.Free headquarters. Unlike her previous glass-paneled corner office overlooking Central Park, this was a forgotten loft in the garment district. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and failure. A single, flickering fluorescent bulb hummed depressingly above a stained executive desk. Dress forms draped in decaying, outdated lace stood in the corners like ghosts of a forgotten era. It was an absolute burial ground. Victoria walked over to the dusty desk. She placed her designer handbag onto the scarred wood. Slowly, she raised her left hand. The 5-carat flawless diamond Clifford had placed on her finger 10 years ago caught the dismal light. It felt impossibly heavy now, like a polished shackle. With a firm, deliberate twist, Victoria pulled the ring over her knuckle. She opened the top drawer of the desk, dropped the multi-million-dollar diamond inside, and locked it. She walked over to the large, grime-streaked window and looked out at the glittering, jagged skyline of Manhattan. The city that worshipped power, the city that had just stripped her of everything. Play with the little fashion boutique, her father had said. Victoria leaned against the glass, an icy, terrifying smile curving her lips. The obedient, perfect wife had died in the Greenwich Conservatory this morning. What remained in this dusty room was a woman with ungodly social connections, a photographic memory for financial weakness, and nothing left to lose. If they wanted her to play, she was going to rewrite the rules of the entire goddamn game. The private cellar of Il Circolo in Milan was a sanctuary of vaulted brick and silence, accessible only to those whose bank accounts or bloodlines predated the Renaissance. Victoria sat at a dimly lit oak table, holding a Zalto wine glass by its delicate stem. Across from her sat Marcello Valenti, the notoriously ruthless patriarch of the Valenti Group, a European conglomerate that controlled billions in luxury retail and international real estate. Marcello was a man who grew bored easily and suffered fools poorly. Victoria took a slow, deliberate sip from the glass, letting the vintage wash over her palate while ignoring the blindfold the sommelier had placed on the table next to her. "A 1996 Barolo," Victoria murmured. Her Italian flawless, carrying the smoky aristocratic lilt of a Milanese native. Gaggia sperse. Annata difficile. ma indomabile. A difficult vintage, Marcello, but indomitable, much like the current state of luxury retail. Marcello's stern, lined face broke into a rare, genuine smile. He clapped his hands once. Bravissima, Victoria. Your ex-husband always drank his wine like he was racing the clock. You, however, understand the value of letting things breathe. So, tell me, why did you fly across the Atlantic to show me a graveyard? Victoria pulled the Maison de Arfave dossier from her Herm Faze Kelly bag. Because it isn't a graveyard, Marcello, it is sleeping beauty, and I have the antidote. She slid the sleek black folder across the table. I am stripping the company down to the studs. No more mass market lace. We are pivoting to hyper-exclusive, quiet luxury couture, by appointment only, no logos. The old money in New York and the new tycoons in the Middle East are exhausted by brand saturation. They want anonymity. They want superiority. I have the heritage brand to give it to them. Marcello peered at the financial projections she had drawn up at 3 a.m. on the flight over. You want 50 million euros in seed capital. That is a substantial bet on a woman who has never run a company. You aren't betting on the company, Victoria said, leaning forward, her blue eyes piercing his. You are betting on my Rolodex. I know the exact measurements, insecurities, and spending habits of every elite family in Manhattan. I built Clifford Vance's empire from behind the curtain. Now, I am stepping in front of it. Marcello looked at her for a long moment, reading the icy, unyielding ambition radiating from her. Gently, he closed the folder. I will have my lawyers draft the term sheet by tomorrow morning. 48 hours later, across the Atlantic, Clifford Vance was sweating through his bespoke collar in the private dining room of Le Bernardin in New York. He desperately needed a $200 million bridge loan to keep his real estate development from collapsing into cross-default. With Victoria gone, his longtime investors were suddenly scrutinizing his books, demanding safety nets he didn't have. His only hope was securing a bailout from the Valenti Group's American proxy, Monsieur Laurent. And then there was Chloe. She sat next to Clifford, wearing a painfully loud, head-to-toe monogrammed Fendi ensemble that screamed, I just got a platinum card, while Laurent, an elegant man in his 60s, quietly discussed European interest rates. Chloe was busy taking flash photography of her caviar with her iPhone. Put the phone away, Clifford hissed under his breath, his knee bouncing under the table. Relax, Jules. It is for my spiritual awakening vlog, Chloe pouted, adjusting her neckline to ensure maximum cleavage. She turned her bright, vacuous smile on the French investor. So Larry, can I call you Larry? Jules tells me your company has, entirely too much money. You know, hoarding wealth creates major blockages in the root chakra. You should really invest in my new holistic retreat in Tulum. We use crystal therapy to realign financial auras. Monsieur Laurent paused, a delicate forkful of sea bass hovering near his mouth. He looked at Chloe as if she were an exotic, slightly repulsive insect. He then slowly shifted his gaze to Clifford, a look of profound pity in his eyes. In the high-stakes world of old money, a man's partner was a reflection of his judgment. Clifford had traded a thoroughbred for a noisy UN housebroken pony. Fascinating, Laurent said dryly, setting his fork down. Tell me, Mr. Vance, your wife, former wife, Victoria, I understand she used to meticulously review all of your international risk assessments. Who handles that now, Miss Chloe and her crystals? Clifford's face flushed a deep, humiliating crimson. Victoria was merely an administrative presence. He lied, his voice tight. My new CFO is handling the transition. But regarding the Hudson Yards loan, We are prepared to offer a 12% yield. I am afraid we must conclude early. Laurent elegantly wiped his mouth with his linen napkin and stood up. The jet lag is catching up to me. We will review your proposal in the morning, Mr. Vance. Good evening. Clifford watched in horror as the lifeline to his empire walked out the door. He turned on Chloe, who was oblivious, happily scooping the rest of his caviar onto her plate. Are you out of your mind? He snarled. Larry, did you just call him Larry? Well, his energy was super toxic anyway. Chloe shot back, rolling her eyes. You don't need him. The universe will provide, Clifford. You just need to manifest harder. Clifford felt a vein throb violently in his temple. He practically sprinted out of the restaurant, ignoring the valet, and locked himself in the back of his waiting SUV. His hands shook as he dialed the direct number for Valenti Group's executive office in Milan. He didn't care what time it was in Italy. He had to salvage this. The phone rang 3 times before an administrative assistant answered. This is Clifford Vance. I need to speak to Marcello Valenti immediately. It is regarding the Hudson Yards Bridge loan. Ah, Mr. Vance, the assistant's polite, Italian-accented voice came through the speaker. I have a note here regarding your file. Mr. Valenti extends his regrets, but our board has frozen all new commercial real estate investments for the quarter. Clifford felt the blood drain from his face. Frozen? What do you mean frozen? Where did the capital allocation go? We have redirected our discretionary fund into the luxury retail sector, the assistant replied smoothly. We closed a €50 million partnership this morning. With who? Clifford barked, desperation clawing at his throat. A heritage fashion house, the assistant said. Perhaps you are familiar with it. Maison de Rarfave. We were exceptionally impressed by their new CEO, Miss Victoria Sterling. Good night, Mr. Vance. The line went dead. Clifford sat alone in the dark SUV, the busy New York traffic, blurring outside his window as the dial tone mocked him. Victoria, she hadn't just walked away. She was already building an empire from the graveyard he sent her to. The fluorescent lights of the Maison de Rarfave loft had been unceremoniously ripped out. In their place, warm, temporary halogens bathed the dusty floors as construction crews worked at a blistering pace. The scent of stale failure was already being replaced by the sharp electric smell of espresso, wet paint, and ambition. Victoria stood in the center of the chaos, wearing an immaculate, tailored white Yves Saint Laurent suit that made her look less like a newly appointed CEO and more like an avenging angel. Pardon me, Madam Sterling, but this is entirely uncalled for. Victoria turned slowly. Marching toward her was Bernard, the brand S holdover creative director. He was a man in his 50s who wore too much cologne and hadn't designed an original silhouette since 2012. Behind him trailed 3 equally terrified, sycophantic junior designers. Bernard, Victoria said, not raising her voice, yet somehow carrying over the sound of the power drills. I distinctly remember requesting the new autumn mood boards on my desk at 8 o'clock this morning. It is now 9:10. I am a visionary, not a clock puncher, Bernard scoffed, crossing his arms, a patronizing smirk on his face. Besides, you are fundamentally disrupting our workflow. You cannot simply walk in here and demand we stop producing our signature ruffle slips. They are our top sellers. Your top sellers are currently sitting in discount bins at suburban outlet malls, Victoria replied, her voice as smooth as glass. You design for women who want to look expensive. I am designing for women who already are expensive. Your vision is entirely incompatible with my reality. You know nothing about fashion. Bernard's face flushed pink. You are just a bored housewife playing dress up with daddy's bankrupt toy. If you try to change my line, I will walk, and I'll take the entire creative team with me. It was a classic power play. In his mind, he was an immovable pillar of the company. Victoria didn't blink. She unclasped her matte black leather portfolio, pulled out a stack of pre-signed severance agreements, and handed them directly to Bernard. I accept your resignation, Victoria said coolly. Your severance is contingent upon you vacating these premises by 10:30. Security is waiting to escort you. Bernard froze, the color draining from his face, as the junior designers behind him gasped. You can't just fire me. You have no one else. Actually, a new voice drawled from the doorway. She has me. A young man stepped into the loft, sidestepping a painter's ladder. He wore heavy black combat boots, a perfectly tailored oversized blazer, and silver rings stacked on his fingers. This was Matteo Rossi. 2 years ago, he was considered the hottest prodigy in the Parisian fashion scene, until he publicly accused a legendary design house of stealing his sketches, resulting in him being blacklisted by the old guard. He was brilliant, angry, and hungry, exactly what Victoria needed. Victoria greeted him with a nod. Welcome to Maison. The floor is yours. Burn everything Bernard created and start fresh. I want designs that whisper wealth but scream danger, silk, structure, and zero logos. Bernard stammered, clutching the severance papers as Victoria turned her back on him, dismissing him entirely. The old era of the company was dead. The exorcism took entirely less than 5 minutes. As Matteo began excitedly walking around the floorboards, sketching in the empty air with his hands, the heavy iron door of the loft, Victoria's immaculate posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. Strutting into the loft wearing a smug smile and a wrinkled Tom Ford suit was her half-brother, Preston. Wow, Preston whistled, kicking a pile of discarded lace with his expensive loafer. Mom wasn't kidding. You really are playing in the garbage dump, though I hear you found some serious trash in here. Preston, Victoria said seamlessly, crossing her arms. I'd ask how you got past the doorman, but I assume you simply oozed under the foundation. What do you want? Preston dropped the act, his eyes flashing with raw greed. He walked up to her makeshift desk and slammed his palms down on the wood. Cut the Ice Queen act, Victoria. The board got wind of the Milano wire transfer this morning. 50 million euros from Valenti Group. Dad is furious. He sent me to take over the integration. You're going to transfer those funds into the Sterling Trust's central commercial account by noon. We reusing it to plug the hole Clifford left in the Hudson Yards deal. Victoria stared at him. The audacity was so breathtaking it bordered on comedic. They had exiled her to this dying company, fed her to the wolves to save their own skin. And the moment she bled a golden drop, they came with their buckets. You want me to hand over the Valenti capital, Victoria clarified softly. To save the family trust. Exactly, Preston smirked, leaning back. Don't pretend you pulled this off on your own. Valenti only gave you the money because of the Sterling name. It belongs to the family. Dad says you can keep your little CEO title, but I am stepping in as CFO. Sign the transfer authorization, sis. Victoria let the silence drag out. She let Preston bask in his unearned victory for 10 full seconds, watching the dull gears of his mind turn. Then she smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant thing. Preston, did you actually read the separation documents you and Father forced me to sign yesterday? Victoria asked, walking around the desk to stand inches from him. Preston frowned. What, the lawyers handled the boilerplate? Her own family exiled her to a bankrupt fashion house to keep her quiet. They drafted separation papers to isolate her legally. And not one of them, not Preston, not Eleanor, not the army of attorneys, bothered to read the fine print of their own weapon. They severed her from the family umbrella, making her a standalone entity free from all claims. They built her a lifeboat and called it a coffin. Preston can't diversify a portfolio, but he is exceptionally gifted at diversifying his family's losses. The lawyers, Victoria interrupted, her voice dropping to a lethal purr. We're trying to build an airtight firewall between me and Clifford to protect your assets. To do that, Maison de Arfave had to be legally completely severed from the Sterling Trust umbrella. Otherwise, Clifford's attorneys could go after it. The color slowly began to vanish from Preston's face. I don't technically work for the Sterling family anymore, Victoria continued, her eyes locking onto his with ruthless joy. You signed away all corporate oversight, all equity, and all board control to me as a standalone entity. Valenti's $50 million didn't go to a Sterling family subsidiary. It went to a private LLC of which I am the sole, indisputable owner. You don't have a legal leg to stand on. You lied to Dad, Preston stuttered, realizing the magnitude of the catastrophic mistake. You set us up. I simply signed the documents you shoved in my face, Victoria corrected elegantly. Now, I am officially a competitor, and Clifford's empire is bleeding. Between the two of you, I intend to buy Manhattan for pennies on the dollar. She picked up her phone from the desk and pressed a single button. The two burly private security guards she had hired that morning immediately stepped out from the shadows near the freight elevator. Please inform our father, Victoria said, turning away from him, that if he or his representatives step foot in my company again without a secured appointment, I will have them arrested for corporate espionage. Ensure he has a nice day, Preston. You are going to regret this, Victoria, Preston yelled as the guards clamped their thick hands on his shoulders, physically dragging him toward the door. Clifford is going to crush you, and the family will let him. Let him try, Victoria called back, the metallic clang of the heavy door snapping shut behind him, cutting off his threats. The loft fell silent again, save for the hum of the halogens. Matteo peered from behind a dress form, his eyes wide. So capo. They want an all-out war. Victoria walked over to a massive floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. Below her, the elite class of New York was entirely unaware that the tectonic plates beneath their feet were about to violently shift. In 3 weeks, the Met Gala was taking place. Clifford would be there, desperately trying to project strength. They wanted a war, Matteo, Victoria murmured, her reflection perfectly calm in the glass. But I am going to give them a slaughter. Grab your sketchbook. We have a gala dress to design. The Metropolitan Museum of Art transformed into a gilded fortress every first Monday in May. 1,000 flashbulbs exploded like continuous lightning across the iconic carpeted steps, capturing the billionaires, the muses, and the aggressively ambitious. Clifford Vance stood near the top of the steps, sweating through his custom Brioni tuxedo. Next to him, Chloe was posing for the cameras with the subtlety of a reality television star. She was poured into a neon fuchsia, sequined monstrosity adorned with heavy ostrich feathers. It was loud, it was ostentatious, and it completely ignored the evening's theme of architectural elegance. Clifford forced a hollow, agonizing smile for the paparazzi. He didn't care about the dresses. His eyes were frantically scanning the VIP reception area inside the Great Hall. Tariq Al-Hassan, the Emirati real estate magnate, was somewhere in that room. Without the Hudson Yards Bridge loan, Clifford found himself exactly 48 hours from defaulting on his creditors. Tariq was his final, desperate lifeline. Jules, look at the cameras, Chloe whined, tugging hard on his arm. My followers are dying to see the back detailing. Stop moving, Chloe, Clifford muttered through gritted teeth. We need to get inside, Tariq. He was cut off by a sudden, jarring shift in the atmosphere. The deafening roar of the paparazzi outside abruptly hushed, shifting into a frantic, breathless volley of camera shutters. It was the kind of feverish attention reserved only for royalty or a legendary scandal. Clifford turned his head. Stepping out of a black armored Maybach at the base of the stairs was Victoria. The air in Clifford's lungs evaporated for 10 years. He had seen Victoria dressed in conservative, respectable pastels, the armor of a compliant Titan's wife. The woman floating up the steps tonight was a reigning monarch of the underworld. She wore Matteo Rossi's inaugural masterpiece for Maison de la Fève. It was a gown of liquid midnight onyx silk, sculpted with impossible architectural precision. It featured a severe asymmetrical neckline that exposed one sharp collarbone and a back plunged dangerously low, structured by an interior corset of gunmetal mesh. There were no logos. There were no blinding diamonds on her neck to distract from her face. Her only accessory was a vintage Cartier Panther ring, gleaming with emerald eyes on her right hand. She radiated silent, lethal, unapproachable wealth. Oh my God, Chloe whispered, her neon feathers suddenly looking tragic and cheap under the museum lights. Who does she think she is? Quiet, Clifford snapped, panic rising in his throat, as the crowd of elites naturally parted for Victoria like the Red Sea. Victoria glided up the stairs, her gaze passing right through Clifford and Chloe as if they were nothing more than a spilled drink on the floor. She entered the great hall, moving with deadly purpose toward the center of the room. Clifford practically dragged Chloe inside, abandoning the photo op. He had to reach Tariq before the night slipped away. He spotted the emirate magnate standing near the Temple of Dender, sipping sparkling water. Clifford adjusted his cuffs, pasted on a winner-esque smile, and approached. Tariq, what an incredible evening, Clifford projected, extending a hand. I've been hoping to catch you. I have the updated projections for the Hudson Yards commercial anchor spaces. We are ready to offer you preferred equity. Tariq did not take the hand. He wasn't even looking at Clifford. He was looking past him, a broad, genuine smile breaking across his regal face. Victoria, my dear. Tariq stepped around Clifford smoothly, extending both hands. Victoria materialized beside them, the midnight silk of her dress absorbing the light. She kissed Tariq on both cheeks. Tariq Amira was absolutely radiant at the fitting in Milan last week. Her opening gala gown is being flown on a private charter as we speak. Clifford froze. Amira was Tariq's notoriously reclusive, ultra-demanding wife. Fitting Milan? She has not stopped talking about your new atelier, Tariq beamed. Maison, yes. She says you actually listen to her, unlike those snobs. Old luxury dictates to the client, Victoria purred, her eyes flashing with dangerous amusement. We exist to elevate them. Speaking of elevating, Tariq, I hope you haven't committed your liquid capital to any volatile domestic real estate. The market is dreadfully unstable right now. Cross defaults are hiding in everyone's portfolios. Clifford felt the blood completely drain from his face. She knew about his toxic asset ratio. You don't say, Tariq's smile cooled instantly, as he cast a sideways, calculating glance at Clifford. I was actually just reviewing a prospectus. Oh, please don't let me interrupt business, Victoria smiled. It was then that Chloe, feeling entirely ignored and vibrating with insecurity, decided to assert herself. She stepped forward, puffing out her feathered chest. You know, Victoria, Chloe said loudly, her shrill voice echoing off the ancient Egyptian stones, drawing the stares of half a dozen billionaires nearby. It is so brave of you to show up tonight, especially wearing something so plain. I guess when Clifford cut off your credit cards, you had to settle for a knockoff. The surrounding silence was absolute. Tariq looked at Chloe as if she had just tracked dog feces into a mosque. Victoria didn't flinch. She slowly turned her head, her glacial blue eyes locking onto Chloe. She didn't look angry. She looked terribly, profoundly bored. "And you must be Clifford's new tax write-off," Victoria said, her voice soft, melodic, and completely devastating. She let her gaze wander lazily over the neon feathers. "You look like a flammable flamingo. Please stand downwind of the candles." A few muffled laughs escaped from the surrounding elite circle. Chloe's face burned a violent shade of magenta, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Victoria, enough," Clifford hissed, stepping between them, his voice trembling with humiliated rage. "You made your point. Now leave Tariq and me to our business. You don't know the first thing about commercial real estate." "Actually, Clifford," Victoria tilted her head, her Cartier Panther ring catching the light as she casually checked her watch. "I know quite a bit. I know that your banks required you to secure an anchor tenant for the flagship retail space at Hudson Yards by midnight tonight, or they trigger the default clause on your bridge loans." Clifford stopped breathing. Victoria took a sleek, ivory embossed envelope from her clutch and handed it to Tariq. "Tariq, as promised, the €50 million letter of credit from Valenti Group. Maison.Free has officially secured the 10-year master lease for the Fifth Avenue Crown Building. We will be placing our flagship there instead." Clifford's knees nearly buckled. The Fifth Avenue Crown Building was owned by Tariq. By Victoria leasing it for her fashion empire, she had simultaneously secured Tariq's loyalty and ensured he wouldn't need to invest in Clifford's desperate Hudson Yards project. Clifford's phone suddenly vibrated violently in his tuxedo pocket. Then again and again, he didn't need to look at the screen to know what it was. It was his CFO, it was the banks, it was the collapse of his empire. "You," Clifford whispered, looking at the spectacular, terrifying woman standing before him. "You orchestrated this. You set me up." "Oh, darling," Victoria smiled, leaning in close so only he could hear the death knell of his legacy. "I didn't set you up. I merely removed the safety net I spent 10 years holding for you." "Have a wonderful evening, Clifford. Try not to trip on the feathers on your way out." Turning gracefully, the midnight silk trailing behind her, Victoria walked away, linking arms with Tariq Al-Hassan as they vanished into the dazzling crowd, leaving Clifford amidst the ruins of his own making. The morning after the Met Gala, the internet did not just break. It shattered into perfectly curated pieces of midnight onyx silk. Inside the newly renovated Fifth Avenue offices of Maison.Free, the phones were ringing with a relentless, melodic frenzy. The cover of Vogue Digital featured a candid, UN watermarked photo of Victoria, walking up the Met steps, entirely unbothered. Under the headline, "Quiet Luxury Gets Loud, the Reinvention of Victoria Sterling." By 9 a.m., the brand's private waitlist portal, which required a $25,000 non-refundable deposit just to secure an appointment, had crashed from web traffic. Victoria sat at her magnificent curved marble desk, sipping a cortado. She looked completely unaffected by the fact that she had just executed a flawless social and financial assassination on live television. 300 appointments, Matteo said, pacing the length of her office, his combat boots clicking on the hardwood. He ran his heavily ringed hands through his hair. 300. Do you know what that means? We have to produce the Core Noir collection in 6 weeks. We need the Como silk. Have you wired the advance to the factory in Italy? Victoria tapped her manicured nail against her coffee cup. The wire was authorized yesterday. They should have confirmed receipt by. She glanced at the Cartier clock on her wall. An hour ago. Just as she reached for her phone, her heavy office doors swung open. Victoria's assistant, a fiercely competent young woman named Elena, stepped in, looking slightly flushed. Miss Sterling, there is a gentleman here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he bypassed security. Before Victoria could respond, a man walked into the office with the casual, devastating arrogance of someone who owned the air he breathed. He was dangerously handsome, perhaps in his early 30s, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that lacked a tie but screamed Savile Row. His hair was dark and slightly swept back, framing sharp aristocratic features and eyes the color of cold espresso. He exuded a raw, predatory energy that instantly made the spacious office feel suffocatingly small. Security in New York is remarkably polite, the man said, his voice a rich, dark baritone with a faint, intoxicating Italian inflection. In Milan, they would have at least drawn a weapon. Victoria didn't stand up. She simply steepled her fingers and held his gaze. You must be Dante Valenti, Marcello's youngest son. Dante smiled, a slow, wolfish expression. My reputation precedes me. I run the private equity division of the Valenti Group. My father sent me to Manhattan to ensure our €50 million investment isn't completely incinerated, though. After watching you effectively castrate your ex-husband at the Met Gala last night, I suspect the money is quite safe. Then why are you here, Dante? Victoria asked smoothly. Because I don't give guided tours, and I certainly don't report to babysitters. Dante walked to the edge of her marble desk and leaned on it, uncomfortably close. He smelled of bergamot, cedar, and expensive danger. I am here because you have a problem, Zarina. A rather large one. He tossed a thick leather folio onto her desk. 20 minutes ago, your ex-husband Clifford Vance executed a hostile buyout of Tessitura Rossi, the only textile mill in Lake Como capable of producing the proprietary double-faced silk Matteo needs for your collection. Dante's dark eyes locked onto hers, testing her. Clifford used the last scraps of his domestic credit line to buy the factory outright. He just canceled your order. You have the demand, Victoria, but you have no fabric. Your brand is paralyzed. Matteo stopped pacing, his face draining of color. Dio mio. Number, we can't use synthetics. The structure of the gown requires that specific density. If we delay the launch, we lose all the momentum. Dante watched Victoria closely, waiting for the panic. He was used to seeing executives crumble under sudden supply chain collapses. He wanted to see if the Ice Queen of Manhattan would melt. Victoria looked at the folio. Then she took another sip of her cortado. Clifford, she murmured, a faint, entertained smile touching her lips, is so predictably tragic. He plays checkers while the rest of us are playing chess. Dante's brow arched. You don't seem concerned that he just cut off your oxygen supply. He didn't cut off my oxygen, Dante. He just bought himself a sinking ship. Victoria stood up, retrieving a file from her locked drawer and dropping it casually next to Dante's folio. When Matteo and I finalized the designs 3 weeks ago, I had my legal team quietly investigate Tessitura Rossi. She opened the file, sliding an environmental report toward Dante. The mill is structurally compromised. The local Italian government has been threatening to condemn the facility for the last 6 months due to toxic dye runoff violations. Upgrades will cost roughly €15 million, cash that Clifford absolutely does not have. Dante leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the documents. His posture shifted from relaxed arrogance to sharp, undivided attention. 2 weeks ago, Victoria continued, pacing slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I secretly bought out a struggling but environmentally compliant boutique mill in Florence. I moved Matteo's proprietary looms there under the cover of night. We already have enough silk stockpiled to produce the first 600 gowns. Matteo blinked, his jaw practically hitting the floor. Wait, we have the silk. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed the market to believe we were completely dependent on the Como mill. Victoria said, turning back to face them, the morning sunlight catching the icy brilliance of her eyes. I deliberately left paper trails of our orders. I knew Clifford's spies would find them. I fed him the bait, and the idiot swallowed it whole. Clifford spent his last millions buying a condemned Italian textile mill to cut off her supply chain, except she had already moved production to Florence weeks earlier. She left breadcrumbs knowing he would follow them off a cliff. He didn't just fall for the trap. He financed it with his own bankruptcy. That is not revenge. That is architecture. Ironic from a woman married to an architect who never saw the blueprint. Silence descended on the office. Clifford, in his desperate bid to destroy her, had just spent his last available millions buying a condemned, useless factory. He had essentially locked himself in a burning building. Dante Valenti stared at Victoria. The patronizing amusement was entirely gone from his face, replaced by a profound, unmistakable look of raw fascination. Old money billionaires spent their whole lives looking for equals in a world full of sycophants. Standing before him was a master predator. You weaponized his own spite to bankrupt him, Dante said softly, almost reverently. I am an efficient woman, Mr. Valenti. Victoria walked back to her desk, closing the file. Now, if your audit is complete, Matteo and I have a fashion empire to launch. You know where the exit is. Dante didn't move immediately. He straightened his suit jacket, his dark eyes lingering on Victoria with a heat that hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. My father told me you were dangerous, Dante murmured, a dangerous smirk returning to his lips. He drastically understated the reality. I look forward to working very closely with you, Victoria. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving a charged, electric atmosphere in his wake. Matteo let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding. Mamma mia, that man is terrifying. He's an investor, Victoria corrected coldly, though her pulse was beating just a fraction faster than normal. Focus, Matteo, call the Florence mill. We double the production cycle. I want the Noir collection ready for the runway in 4 weeks. Clifford Vance was bleeding out. It was time for Victoria to deliver the final strike. The backstage of the Park Avenue Armory was a beautiful, organized apocalypse. Dozens of models, severe and stunning, darted between hair and makeup stations. The air was thick with the scent of Orababe hairspray, espresso, and pure adrenaline. Through the heavy velvet curtains, the low pulsing bass of the runway soundtrack was already making the floorboards vibrate. The front row tonight wasn't just celebrities. It was the financial and fashion royalty of Europe and New York. Victoria stood by the monitors, immaculate, in a sharply tailored, backless tuxedo jumpsuit. She was adjusting the drape of a midnight silk neckline on a model when her assistant, Elena, rushed over, her face pale. Miss Sterling, Elena whispered, her voice tight with panic over the heavy bass. We have a situation at the loading dock. It's Clifford Vance. He brought in federal marshals. He has an injunction. Victoria's hands didn't shake. She precisely pinned the fabric, patted the model's shoulder, and turned around. The ice in her eyes had solidified into absolute zero. Show me. Victoria strode down the dimly lit concrete corridor toward the service entrance, her heels clicking like a ticking clock over the thumping music. Clifford was standing near the heavy steel doors, flanked by two grim-faced men holding thick legal binders. The Clifford from a month ago, the polished, arrogant air, was gone. The man standing there looked unraveled. His suit hung loosely on his frame, his eyes were bloodshot, and there was a manic, desperate twitch in his jaw. "Stop the music, Victoria," Clifford shouted as soon as he saw her. "It is over. I have a court-ordered cease and desist. You are stealing marital intellectual property." Victoria stopped 10 feet away, crossing her arms. "I see the toxic dye from the Como mill has finally seeped into your brain. Clifford, my designs are original." "The capital wasn't," Clifford snarled, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You used my connections, my society standing, to secure the Valenti money. The brand belongs in the marital trust. If I go down, you go down with me, Marshal. Serve her." The official stepped forward, but before he could cross the distance, a dark, impeccably polished Oxford shoe stepped out from the shadows of an adjacent corridor, cleanly blocking his path. "I wouldn't hand her that piece of paper, my friend," a velvet, smooth, dark baritone voice echoed in the corridor, "unless you want to be named as a co-conspirator in a massive financial fraud." Clifford froze. Stepping into the fluorescent light was Dante Valenti. He wore a midnight blue velvet dinner jacket, looking like a lethal modern-day prince. He didn't look at the marshals. His dark, predatory eyes were fixed entirely on Clifford, watching him like a wolf watches a wounded deer. Valenti Clifford spat, though he instinctively took a half-step back. "This is a domestic marital dispute. Stay out of it. Normally, I loathe getting my hands dirty in the domestic squabbles of the American nouveau riche," Dante drawled lazily, walking to stand shoulder to shoulder with Victoria. The sheer, overwhelming power radiating from the two of them standing together was suffocating. "But you see, Clifford, you made a grave miscalculation. You breached your contract with your primary creditors yesterday." Clifford's face went paper white. "How? How do you know about that?" "Because," Dante smiled, a terrifying, bloodless thing. "As of 3 p.m. today, the Valenti Group bought your outstanding corporate debt from your panicked syndication banks at a 40% discount. We own you, Clifford." The silence in the corridor was deafening, broken only by the distant, rhythmic bass of the runway music. "I am your primary secured creditor," Dante said softly, stepping closer to Clifford. The marshals intuitively backed away. "And my forensic accountants found that you used corporate debt lines to purchase that condemned factory in Italy, attempting to mask it as a private asset to hide it from divorce proceedings. That is federal wire fraud. I have already forwarded the dossier to the SEC and the Manhattan District Attorney." Clifford staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck. "Number? No, you can't, Victoria. Victoria, please." He looked at his ex-wife, the woman he had discarded, humiliated, and tried to destroy. He fell to his knees on the cold concrete. "Vicky, please. They'll lock me up. Tell him to stop. We were married for 10 years. Victoria looked down at him. She felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no triumph, just the dull realization of how entirely insignificant he was. "Elena," Victoria called over her shoulder softly, "have security remove this trespasser. The flashbulbs are waiting out front, and I'm sure the paparazzi would love a shot of Mr. Vance." "Victoria," Clifford screamed as Dante's private security detail materialized, grabbing him by the arms and dragging him out the steel doors. His screams faded into the sirens of the New York night. The heavy doors slammed shut. The threat was completely, permanently eradicated. Dante turned to Victoria, seamlessly pulling a piece of lint off his velvet lapel. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, Zarina. I saw him marching toward the back and thought you might appreciate the distraction handled. Victoria turned to face him, the ambient light catching the sharp angles of her face. I had it under control, Dante. I know you did, Dante murmured, taking a step closer, breaching her personal space. The scent of cedar and expensive danger washed over her. He didn't look at her like a damsel. He looked at her with dark, burning reverence. That's precisely why I find you so intoxicating. But a queen shouldn't have to swat away her own flies. Victoria's breath hitched. Just slightly, though she refused to break eye contact. The air between them crackled with an electric, dangerous energy. It wasn't the soft, safe romance she had tried to build with Clifford. This was a collision of equals. The show is starting, Mr. Valenti, Victoria whispered, her voice holding a warning that sounded far too much like an invitation. Then let's not keep your empire waiting, he replied smoothly, offering her his arm. Victoria took it together. They walked through the velvet curtains and took their seats in the front row. The lights dropped, the bass hit like a thunderclap. The Noir collection hit the runway. It was a masterclass in aggressive elegance. Midnight silks, structured corsets, asymmetrical cuts that defied gravity. The audience sat in stunned, breathless silence. And then, as the finale gown, a devastating piece of architectural lace and silver threading, was presented, the entire armory erupted into a standing ovation. Maison.Free wasn't just a brand anymore. It was a religion. Amidst the roaring applause and blinding camera flashes, Dante leaned over, his lips brushing perfectly against Victoria's ear. "Checkmate, Victoria," he whispered over the applause. "Now, what are we going to conquer next?" 1 year later, Paris. The night air of Avenue Montaigne was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and blooming jasmine. Victoria stood on the wrought iron balcony of the penthouse suite at the Plaza Ath Fei, a crystal flute of vintage Dame Fignon in her hand. Below her, the street was illuminated by the golden, glowing facade of the newest Maison.Free flagship store. The midnight onyx marble storefront stood proudly between Dior and Chanel, not as an arrogant newcomer, but as an undisputed equal. "You are going to catch a chill, Zarina?" The deep, familiar baritone was accompanied by the heavy warmth of a bespoke cashmere coat being draped over her bare shoulders. Victoria leaned back instinctively into Dante's chest. His arms wrapped around her waist, grounding her in the intoxicating mix of cedar, bergamot, and him. "I am just admiring the view," Victoria murmured, taking a sip of the champagne. Dante rested his chin softly on top of her head. "It's a good view." The quarterly reports for the European expansion dropped an hour ago. "We are outperforming our wildest projections by 40%. The Valenti board is practically building a shrine in your honor back in Milan." "They should," Victoria smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that she reserved only for him. They had spent the last 12 months tearing through the global luxury market like a beautifully synchronized hurricane, where Victoria provided the visionary genius and absolute ruthlessness. Dante provided the impenetrable financial fortress and the global infrastructure. They weren't just a power couple. They were a sovereign state. "Did you see the Wall Street Journal this morning?" Dante asked casually, his thumb gently drawing circles on her hip. "I rarely have time for the Metro section," she replied smoothly. A brief mention on page 4. Former real estate heir Clifford Vance was officially transferred to Allenwood Federal Correctional Complex today to begin his 5-year sentence for wire fraud. Apparently, his neon-feathered girlfriend left him for an aspiring DJ in Ibiza before the trial even began. Victoria looked out at the glittering Eiffel Tower in the distance. A year ago, the mention of Clifford's name would have brought a sharp spike of anger, or a cold wave of betrayal. Now it invoked nothing at all. He was simply dust swept away from the grand halls of her new life. "I wish him well," Victoria said effortlessly. And the beautiful truth was, she meant it. The eagle does not concern itself with the affairs of the worm. Dante chuckled, a low, dark sound that vibrated against her back. He turned her around so she was facing him. The night wind caught her hair, sweeping it across her face. Dante reached out, his long fingers gently tucking the strands behind her ear. The predatory, calculating billionaire the world saw was completely stripped away, leaving only a man profoundly in awe of the woman standing before him. "You built an empire, Victoria," he said softly. His dark eyes locked onto her glacial blue ones. Victoria reached up, her hand resting over his heart. She felt the steady, strong beat beneath the crisp fabric of his shirt. "Correction, Mr. Valenti," Victoria whispered, a dangerous, beautiful smile playing on her lips. "I took back what was mine, and we built an empire." She didn't need a golden cage anymore. The entire sky belonged to her. Dante leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of champagne, absolute power, and the promise of tomorrow. Behind them, the lights of Paris burned brightly. But they were nothing compared to the reigning Czarina of it all. Let's talk about the graveyard. When Victoria's family handed her maison-de-Free, they thought they were handing her a toy, a dusty attic to keep the embarrassing daughter busy, while the men salvaged the real empire. Her mother said, "Play with the little fashion boutique." Her father said, "Let the men handle the crisis." Her half-brother, a man whose greatest achievement was losing $2 million in a single weekend in Macau, was handed her board seat as a reward for having a Y chromosome. They looked at Victoria and saw liability. She looked at maison-de-Free and saw raw material. That distinction is the entire story. Because here is what Clifford, Eleanor, Preston, and every smirking suit in that Greenwich conservatory failed to understand. Victoria was never powerful because of the sterling name. The sterling name was powerful because of Victoria. She doubled the trust's yields. She shielded Clifford's chaotic bookkeeping. She managed his international risk assessments so flawlessly that when she left, a French billionaire investor noticed the absence within one dinner. She was the engine, and they mistook her for the hood ornament. Now, Chloe. Let us give Chloe the brief clinical autopsy she deserves. A spiritual wellness coach who told a French billionaire to manifest harder, offered to realign his root chakra, to unblock hoarded wealth, and called Monsieur Laurent Larry at Le Bernardine. While photographing her caviar for a vlog, Clifford traded a woman who could identify a 1996 Barolo blindfolded in flawless Italian for a woman who showed up to the Met Gala dressed as, and I will quote Victoria here, a flammable flamingo. That is not a midlife crisis. That is an extinction event for good judgment. But the real villains of this story are not Clifford and Chloe. It is the family. Eleanor's advice when her daughter's husband paraded his mistress at a charity gala was not leave him. It was smile, take the girl shopping, and secure the trust fund for your future children. She told Victoria that marriages at their echelon are corporate mergers, that a smart woman absorbs humiliation quietly and protects the stock price. And when Victoria refused to comply, Eleanor's response was to strip her of her board seat, hand it to an incompetent son, and suggest that perhaps if Victoria had been less consumed with her spreadsheets, her husband wouldn't have needed a 20-something with a sage bundle. Read that again, the mother-in-law blamed Victoria's career for her husband's infidelity. The father weaponized her womb as a performance metric. The half-brother treated her exile as his promotion. This was not a family, it was a cartel, and Victoria was the asset they tried to liquidate. She liquidated them instead. She secured 50 million euros from a man who respected her palate more than her family ever respected her mind. She designed a supply chain trap so elegant that Clifford bankrupted himself executing it. She walked into the Met Gala in midnight onyx silk. No logos, no diamonds, no borrowed power, and redirected her ex-husband's last investor with a single sentence about cross defaults. She didn't just build a fashion house, she built a sovereign nation, and she did it from a dusty loft in the garment district that smelled of failure and flickering fluorescent lights. The final detail: Clifford ended up in federal prison. 5 years for wire fraud. Chloe left him for a DJ in Ibiza before the trial concluded. His mother's country club friends saw the whole implosion in real time. Every pillar of the life he chose over Victoria collapsed, one by one, in public. Victoria's response when she heard the news: "I wish him well." And she meant it, because that is the sound of a woman who has moved so far beyond the wreckage that she can't even see it in the rearview mirror. So here is my question for tonight. Have you ever been handed the worst possible outcome, the dead-end assignment, the company graveyard, the role no one wanted, and turned it into something that terrified the people who gave it to you? Tell me in the comments. I suspect some of you are sitting on stories that need telling. Stay sharp, ladies. Madam Read out.